Welcome to America's Nest Egg, the secret war for global food security. Today's food supply is connected by a complex supply chain powered by old and new technologies. On this show, we'll delve into the science, unveil the stories behind our food sources, and discuss what's shaping our food's future. I'm your host, Arjun Ganesan, CEO of Ancera. We believe that our mission is one of the most critical in human history. It is to make food abundant, affordable, and safe, and to build the operating systems behind it. On today's episode, we sit down with Aaron Schacht, CEO of BiomEdit. With over 30 years of experience, Aaron has served as Executive Vice President at Elanco Animal Health and its various research and development positions at Eli Lilly and Company. His expertise extends from R&D strategy to drug development to mergers and acquisitions. We're excited to have Aaron here today to talk about all of this and more. Welcome, Aaron.
Arjun, thanks a lot. I'm happy to be here.
Aaron, it's great to see you again. Why don't you, in your own words, give us a little bit about your background, your life's journey, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm a scientist by training. I started life as a chemist, and I graduated from university back in 1990 and joined Eli Lilly and Company as a research chemist. And I was focused on making molecules that I hope would become drugs someday. Didn't quite hit the jackpot that way. Of course, it wouldn't have been a jackpot for me anyway, but didn't ever have a molecule that I made make it to become a drug product. But I learned a lot about what it takes to do that, both in the lab and then in my career for the next 20 years outside of the lab, where I got involved in R&D strategy. I led portfolio management for a while, external innovation projects and leadership, product development leadership. And then my career at Lilly culminated with a move over to the little animal health division called Elanco Animal Health. And that was in 2015. And over the course of the next 6 years, I led R&D, business development, and regulatory affairs. One way I like to think about the role I had is if Elanco was going to have a new revenue stream, it probably came from the efforts I led or the people that worked for me while I was at Elanco. And of course, midway through that 6-year period, Elanco reached escape velocity from Lilly through an IPO, and then ultimately became independent. And then the last 3 years were all about trying to realize the full potential of a standalone animal health company operating at the top tier of scale in the animal health industry.
Oh, super. Thank you. As a scientist that's now a business leader, Aaron, I mean, one of the things, can you help us just think about the commonalities and the similarities of the yesteryears of human pharma, and then basically what you see as the promise for making the food supply more resilient?
Yeah, there's no question that biotechnology is transforming how we think about human medicine, and as a result, how do we think about health of any organism in that regard? And so that's where really human health is really, obviously the investment levels are so much greater in human health. The risk, because of the risk-taking ecosystem that's so mature in human health, is really defined by leaps and bounds what we can do in terms of modulating the biology and getting a different or better effect ultimately for the subjects, right, or the patients that we're trying to treat. So all of those lessons, I think, over the last 30 years have yet to be fully realized in their application in animal health. We're in the first decade of this, biotech era in animal health, and the neat thing about it is we're not giving up on chemistry. Chemistry still plays a role, right? But biotechnology is a cumulative approach on top of it. So we're entering a new era in animal health where all of the findings and learnings and all the tools that have been developed on the human health side can now apply into animal health, but we don't have to, we're not waiting for them to, sort of develop over time. They're all there now. So I sort of think about this like, what would it be like to get a phone in China for the first time? It was a cell phone, right? They didn't have to wait for, landlines and all of those things to happen before they had that ability to take an integrated technology and now get the full benefit of it. So in some ways, that time warp for animal health is happening now.
Oh, it's beautiful. You run a very interesting company. The name of the company is BiomEdit. And we've spoken about synthetic biology, Aaron. But for our listeners, can you tell them basically what synthetic biology is as a concept? And another big piece over here is the words gene editing. There's just so many tiers of understanding across people. So I'm sure the audience would love to listen to both your take on synthetic biology and why synthetic biology has such a significant role to play in the future. Can you touch on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I think synthetic biology is a collective term for anything you would do to engineer a cell. So a cell has a certain inborn set of programming of the biological circuits that it's going to have and the functions that it's going to complete. And synthetic biology aims to change that in some meaningful way, delete something bad, add something good, change the ratio of certain things. And the word editing, I think, is a good word because the editor, it takes an already existing piece and makes it better, right? Tweaks it, improves it, finds ways to maybe make things deliver more efficiently. And so, we adopted the term BiomEdit to reflect really two concepts. One is the microbiome is fundamental to how an animal feeds and produces protein. Um, and that can sometimes get messed up, either pathogens or stress or other influences. And so we can edit a microbiome by changing the composition and function of the microbes that are present. We can make it better. But at the same time, we believe that that may not be enough to elicit the effect that we're looking for. So maybe we need to edit the organisms too
Makes
that make
sense.
up that microbiome. And so we do a little of both. Some of it's synthetic biology, some of it is advanced microbiology, but the collection of it is what we call biomedicine.
It makes so much sense. Um, the world of animal health had antibiotic growth promoters, which were a pretty significant part of how we kept animals healthy, over the last 40, 50 years, right? And that has been a tool that the U.S. consumer has basically said that it's not one that they want to see in their supply chain, and it's largely made its way out. You have a lot of experience in understanding antibiotics and then basically thinking about how this new slew of products that can actually help more improved animal health. Can you talk a little bit about that transition period?
Yeah.
That'd be super.
Yeah, and Elanco was really ground zero for a lot of the potential dramatic impact in the changing of really leadership positions within animal health based on the concept that antimicrobial resistance was becoming a dominant concern. And just to sort of level set around that, the concern manifests because of the abundant use of antibiotics in animals that, and these antibiotics belong to classes of antibiotics that are also used in humans. Not all of the antibiotics used in animals belong to those classes, but some do. And so the concern is that becomes a vector for resistance. The more it gets used in real life and the more pathogens that get killed because of an antibiotic, the more that don't get killed can now thrive and survive and demonstrate resistance. And the concern is that would spill over into human medicine and now create resistant bugs that could infect humans. Um, and so because of the prominent use of antibiotics for growth promotion and for protection from disease, society spoke up and said, this is a meta risk now. We need to do something about it. And animal health industry, you're going to be regulated to do something about it. And so that's a sea change. And so you have to adapt and and Elanco was at ground zero, more antibiotics in feed than anybody probably over the, prior 2 decades, right, in the
Makes
animal health
sense.
industry came from Elanco. And so leading Elanco at the time, when I joined, the CEO of Elanco, Jeff Simmons, had made a commitment that Elanco would lead the charge on identifying alternatives to antibiotics. And that was sort of tongue in cheek. He wasn't leading the charge. He gave me the assignment to say, figure out how do we come up with R&D programs that could be reasonable alternatives to antibiotics. And so as a chemist, I sort of simplified the challenge to say the problem with antibiotics is they're chemicals, and they give us such an easy target for resistance to emerge around. We've got to play a different kind of game, right? We've got to elevate our tactics. And so And the tactics are there in the microbiome. We just don't understand them, right? We know pathogens can coexist with good microorganisms,
Right.
and resistance doesn't manifest. So how do we learn from that and take advantage of it? And then and so that's what we set about to do, to build a platform of microbial discovery that allows us to unlock the secrets of how to maintain a healthy biological context for the animal, i.e., manage the pathogen burden in the gut of an animal so they can feed and produce effectively without disease, but don't give the pathogen such an easy way around with something that inspires or stimulates resistance.
Oh, thank you. Your team also does some really incredibly interesting work around cattle emissions, right? So it's not just about
Right.
suppression of harmful pathogens within the supply. Can you talk a little bit about how there's some out of the box thinking going on over here, right? Which is tying the microbiome to potentially looking at how can emissions be lowered. Can you talk about that at a high level, please?
Yeah, sure. So methane emission happens in a rumen of a cow. That's the what we call the digestive system of a cow. It's a rumen. Rumen is basically a fermentation vessel. So the cow eats plant fiber, and the microorganisms in that cow's rumen ferment the plant fiber. And one of the byproducts of that fermentation is hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas builds up in the rumen, and the best microorganisms present to take hydrogen and consume it are things called methanogens.
Mhm.
They actually convert hydrogen into methane. And so their job, and they belong to a class of organism called archaea, and archaea are some of the longest lived microorganisms in the whole genetic phyla of microorganisms. And they have one common characteristic: they do one thing really, really well, right? They pick a niche and they dominate it. These are the same organisms that are found in the thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean,
Right.
right? Consuming hydrogen there, right? And then creating some organic byproduct that's useful to that ecosystem. So they're incredibly adept at dominating a niche and doing one thing really well.
Got it.
And so they consume hydrogen better than any other organism in the rumen. And as a result, they produce methane. Now, science has taught us that you can have different rumen microbiome compositions and have less and more methane emission associated with that. So we know there are some microorganism combinations or concoctions that do a better job of competing for hydrogen than others, right? So that's one set of secrets that we aim to try to unlock. And then, but also then building on this concept of so we can edit the microbiome of a rumen to
Sure.
say let's create a low methane emitting phenotype by
Hmm.
competing effectively for that hydrogen, right? So let's swarm it with organisms that are really good at it and maybe get enough of them in there in a stable representation so that we effectively reduce the ability of those methanogens to dominate that niche.
That
Okay,
makes a lot of
but maybe
sense.
that's not enough. Maybe what we need to do is to provide some sort of inhibition of the methanogen directly. And so this is where engineering organisms can come in. And our strategy is to find important proteins, for example, associated with certain pathogens or bacteria, and neutralize them, develop molecules that neutralize them, or provide molecules that somehow disrupt normal functioning of that pathogen. And so our strategy entails both reshaping the rumen microbiome, but then delivering some sort of added punch with a biological molecule that's been edited into one of these organisms.
Can you talk to me a little bit about just how, in the current world of animal health service providers, this is a brand new kind of company, right? So, can you talk a little bit about um, beyond the BiomEdit component of what you just described for us, other key ways? So, for example, I'm thinking very specifically about how you've partnered up with a company that that has to do with actually understanding emissions a little bit better, right? So you're connecting the supply
Yeah.
chain beyond just providing animal health, and I'm sure the path you're on also has its fair share of challenges. Can you talk a little bit about it, just from the lenses of a regular consumer? What are some things that people can be thinking about that can make BiomEdit a successful venture, right? I mean, because we're talking about some
Right.
big challenging things that you're trying to take on over here.
Yeah, it's a great framing, Arjun. It gives me an opportunity to talk about something I think we're particularly proud of in how we've envisioned strategy for BiomEdit, and that is we think in terms of and, not or. And let me explain. Livestock production, for example, has largely been an or situation, right? I get
Can you dig into
productivity.
that a little bit more? Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the focus has been on driving productivity,
Hmm.
but I'm willing to sacrifice the risk of antimicrobial resistance or the impact on the environment or food safety in order to get more protein. That's, I mean, it's undeniable, but that's been the record. That hasn't been a conscious decision by an industry. That's been the emergent property
Right.
of an industry that's been singularly focused on livestock production. And I think what society has said is you got to do better, right? There's an and here. You got to be able to give us productivity, but not create these other problems or contribute to these other problems. And so we think about it as and. How do we use what we can do to solve both simultaneously? Can I deliver livestock productivity to the livestock producer and deliver something that society expects? Lower antimicrobial risk, lower food safety risk, lower environmental impact. And so that to me is the next era of livestock production, is being able to tackle more than one thing at a time and find technological ways to not have to compromise.
No, and I think the area of science that you're dealing with, there are planned as well as unintended consequences, right? That's just a rule of science almost.
Right.
And one of the things that really I find very compelling about you and your team is being able to measure vectors that are otherwise not seen, right? So can you talk
Right.
a little bit about
Sure.
just a couple of things? One is you'd shown interest very specifically on the nature of looking at something that's subclinical. So I'd love to hear your take on that. I thought that was a really interesting take. The other one is just in terms of these emissions, very specifically translating that into actual dollars and cents. So I think that those are two areas that you've
Yeah.
shown a lot of interest in. Love to get one more layer deeper, please.
Yeah, and I think it's the nature of science to try to reduce things to as simple framework as possible, right? And that's where we end up with productivity trumps other things,
Right.
or antibiotics is a sledgehammer, right? And so I think that there's nuance, right, that you need to be concerned about, as well as the unintended consequences and trying to make them intentional. So let's talk about the nuance of a subclinical, right? It's the way in which we can study infectious pathogen burden, right, in a laboratory, or let's say a conjured setting where we're going to do smaller studies, very much steps away from the real world practice of let's say broiler production,
Right.
right? Of course it uses birds, and of course it uses birds in some sort of environment where they're fed and treated. But if you go to a small outfit like Southern Poultry Research Group, nobody from Tyson would say that's a good mimic of what we do. That's a
Right.
proper representation. It's very good for generating data that you want to use to talk to regulators about the effects of your product or the safety of your product, but it's not the data that a customer needs, right?
Right.
It's not sufficient for what it takes to get them to conviction to use your product. So you got to come up with other ways to understand their problems in the real world. And so they don't challenge their birds, right, to have an outbreak at a certain level of mortality. They just observe that in the real practice, right? And
It's hard
it
to
may
simulate
happen,
chaos, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
right. It may happen or it may not happen,
Right.
right? And so, and I think one of the things that drew me to you guys, or us to you guys, is you're looking at surrounding the definition of the health of the animal with multiple streams of data,
Right.
right? Looking at pathogen burden, looking at health state, looking at practices. All of that is what that livestock producer has to integrate, right, in order to
Makes
make a
sense.
decision. So we might as well give them more data of the kind that they're used to using in the application of our products. And I think that's where there's great potential. Instead of telling them to set aside their instincts and the aggregate knowledge that they have and look at through this narrow lens of a challenge study that we've run that the regulators said worked.
Right.
Okay. So we have to do more to simulate what's going on in their environment ahead of asking them to trust us.
Yeah, no, and I
And then
deeply applaud what you
and
guys
be able
do.
to surround the product with the proof points when it is used in the real world. It's actually hitting on those measures they care about.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Switching a little bit over here, thinking about emerging risks to our supply chain, right? So,
Mhm.
um, one parallel that you discussed with me was about think about food as energy. I just found that so interesting. Can you double click on that a little bit, because I think that that's a fairly novel thought that I haven't really heard anywhere else.
Yeah, the food supply is the source of energy for human activity and ambition, right? And so I think we should worry about hunger, obviously, people not getting enough. But what happens with the people who do get enough being suddenly disrupted to not have enough?
Right.
And so it's a different version of the same problem, but it has major consequences depending on the scale of the problem, right? I mean, I think hunger and poor nutrition on a population scale is heartbreaking,
Right.
right? But an immediate loss of a source of food, right, disables all of the people who are trying to solve that problem. Okay, so it has consequence effects at a different scale when you think of it that way.
Um, so one thing that is really interesting, Aaron, is people spoke about this a lot during COVID. Very specifically, it's the ability to engineer organisms that may be engineered against human health. But over here, your company is probably the first one that is actually capable of these sorts of rapid response to future threats that may come against our food supply. And can you talk a little bit about that, please? Just the power of rapid iteration to it's a new world that we're in right now. So if you can touch on that, that'll be super.
Yeah, I think, and let's just maybe make the problem a little more concrete. Let's just say that, some malicious party engineers a bacteria or a virus to be a food pathogen,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's hard to identify and hard to kill.
Or something that
Um,
destroys the animal altogether, right? So where it doesn't even
yeah,
have the
right.
opportunity of becoming
Yeah,
food.
yeah. So let's stay there. Yeah. So somebody wants to take out broiler chickens,
Yep.
right, out of the food chain, and a rapidly spreading bacterial pathogen that'll do that. I think in our context, what we should be able to determine is what is the nature of that pathogen's ability to kill a chicken, right? And then quickly and rapidly, because we've come to understand what it means to try to populate the chicken's gut with beneficial microbes, and these are also microbes that we've proven we have a platform to engineer, right? We should be able to figure out which bioproducts from that pathogen are causing the damage to those chickens, and we should be able to engineer something that neutralizes, right, those proteins, those bad proteins caused by that bad pathogen, and or disrupt the pathogen's activity directly through things like antimicrobial peptides or neutralizing antibodies for key targets on the surface of the bacteria. So I think we have a skill set and a set of tools where we could go from, if you told me the protein sequence of a neutralizing antibody for a toxin caused by this new pathogen, in 4 months' time, we could have a bacteria expressing that antibody that would colonize the gut of a chicken really well.
Got it.
And a year ago, I would have said that would take 12 months.
It's fantastic.
Okay. And so in the course of the last year, we've been able to reduce that cycle time of going from a protein sequence to an engineered bacteria expressing that protein in 4 months.
Thank you. Um, the other big part of it is probiotics for animals, right? So it's not just about defense, it's also about
Right.
certain things that can augment. Can you talk a little bit about just what do probiotics look like in animals? I mean, a lot of our listeners may not have an animal health background. So can you touch a little bit on that and the importance of that in the overall ecosystem and what BiomEdit is bringing there?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of antibiotics from a growth promotion standpoint were the antibiotics' ability to sort of suppress certain active organisms that might not have been the source of infection, but were doing other things to thwart proper functioning in the gut. And so unlocking maybe the more broad spectrum effects of an antibiotic and how much of it is pathogen protection versus growth promotion is actually some work we've done and published on. And I think what it taught us is when you can use probiotics to supplement the microbiota in a chicken, for example, to be the most healthy, right, microbiome that you can imagine, or at least you can describe at that point. And you can restore, you can reduce inflammation, You can resolve gut permeability. You can make sure that what goes in as feed gets properly converted into the nutrients and properly absorbed by a high functioning intestine, right? And that's what a probiotic is designed to do. It's designed to, and it also brings an immune property, right? Most um, animals, humans and animals, the immune system is dominated in the gut. 60 to 70% of the immune cells reside in the gut, for example, in a human. And so the microbiome is key to keeping that immune function patent.
Right.
And so for all those reasons, knocking down inflammation, improving gut permeability, improving gut integrity, improving better release of nutrients, et cetera, can all be accomplished by the right concoction of microorganisms.
Got it. Um, just thinking about the world, right? So if you think about it, chicken, which is one of the markets that you're going after, is almost the most affordable protein for the world, right? So when people can start affording things, that's where they go to. But as you think about this, not in the current regulatory landscape, but as you think about the consumer adoption of of and keeping that adoption of meeting this supply, can you talk a little bit about um, various threats that are there, and basically what can we do today, right? So being a very American company based out of Indiana, what are things that that Aaron and Aaron's team is doing to basically secure that future?
Yeah, so I think the first biggest threat is really population expansion, right? I mean, I think we live in a world today where 7 billion is going to be 10 billion
Yep.
humans on the planet, and right now agriculture consumes all the resources it needs in a year to produce protein to feed 9 billion people in a half a year.
Right.
So somehow we're not scaling to meet the opportunity, right, of a world that has 10 billion inhabitants. So that's the first obvious threat. Now that can be accomplished over time, but anything we do today to make food more affordable and more abundant will have a dramatic economic effect on the prosperity of the humans on the planet, right? If I'm spending less on food and the food is higher quality per unit of dollar spent, I'm improving livelihoods of people,
Right.
right? And so, regardless of whether you want to solve world hunger or you just want to make life better, right? We have a reason to have a purpose, and most of the folks at BiomEdit are sort of in the background inspired by that. All of us are inspired by the cool technology that we get to develop and the way in which we get to, change expectations, raise expectations for livestock producers, veterinarians, and pet owners, because we bring better products than the ones that they're used to. At least that's our ambition.
Aaron, one more really important point is about antimicrobial resistance, right? So people tend to think a lot about AMRs in right now, and very specifically, what does that mean for the population as well as the environment? As a scientist, can you talk a little bit about that in just simple language? How much of there is there evidence, and how much of there is you touched on that a little bit earlier in the podcast, but can you double click a little bit more expansively, thinking what does this look like from an antimicrobial resistance for the next decade or two?
So yeah, antimicrobial resistance, it's a meta challenge. There's no question, right? I think we can reduce it to specific problems that we want to address right now, and we can actually, in some ways, make it seem like it's less of a dominant threat. And let me give you an example. So there are probably 16 or 18 classes of antibiotics where they're commonly used in human health, and there's some concern around resistance, right? That the antibiotics we use today might not work, right? Only two of those classes are prominently used in animal health, okay? But two of those classes are prominently used in animal health. And so we ought at least curtail the risk associated with the use of those classes and do something to work around those. Because if we solve the problem in animals, we'll prevent the problem in humans, okay?
Right.
But we can learn so much by working in animals, right? And so how much more understanding do we unlock to deal with the other 16 classes where, resistance mechanisms can emerge,
Right.
and those vectors can develop. Our understanding of having worked the problem and solved the problem in animal health probably sheds light on how to tackle these problems in analogous scenarios. So you not only get the benefit of developing the science and creating an animal product, you get a translational benefit to other human challenges that might benefit from the knowledge created thereby.
Got it. Just switching gears to politics for a little bit. This is the year where the next farm bill may really be passed, right? So, where you guys sit is at such an interesting spot across just so many different species. And one thing we know that some of our listeners are also policymakers. So, what would you encourage the policymakers to think about the next half a decade, next decade, as we think about the next farm bill? How should we be preparing for the future with this broad and reaching theme that you just have pointed out for us?
Yeah, a couple things, and this is sort of coming off the top of my head. It's a great question, and there's a couple of places to jump in. One is I come back to and versus or, and I'll start first with we need more protein in general, okay? And we've seen probably over the last decade an emerging enthusiasm for alternate sources of protein to replace animal protein, right? Or to compete with animal protein.
Right.
It's not an or, it's an and. We need both. If you're going to feed 10 billion people, we need everything that animal health can do, and we need everything that cell-based meat can do, and plant-based meat can do, and insect as food can do. We need all those things, right, to feed humans and provide the essential protein necessary to have, healthy brain growth for children, et cetera. So start first with don't think about this as a competition, right? But as a broad composition of solutions to the problem of agriculture, which, by the way, we're highly dependent on from an economic livelihood standpoint for a large swath of our population. So good food supply means there are good jobs that we're creating that good food supply. So there's a clear economic benefit there. Second, we're in an emerging period of a biotechnology renaissance. And so we're getting to learn how to master and apply technologies at scale, and agriculture is one great place to do it. And again, the what we learn in agriculture, either the plant side or the animal side, could have benefits for human medicine. So let's not be shy about investing in those places. Let's make sure that we have, an ecosystem of innovation that can support that, because otherwise we'll miss out on key advances, I believe, right? Where things can be studied and learned. And then finally, the last is how do we anticipate and deal with threats, right? How do we get on the front feet of either naturally occurring, right, threats to our food supply, or unnaturally occurring threats to our food supply, and recognize that biotechnology is going to be a large part of the solution, or most likely will be very relevant in any solution that comes to bear. So I think we're in an exciting time for policymakers to understand, particularly in America, where our biotechnology muscle can be leveraged more fully in the context of food production than it ever has been.
Right.
And that's not just a way to feed people, grow the economy, but it's a way to protect the people who produce that economy as well.
No, it just reminds me so much about the Haber-Bosch process, right? So when it comes to nitrogen fixation, it was one of those things that ushered in this next really, really big change in how we can improve the productivity with nitrogen fixation. It just seems to me like you're at this deeply interesting spot in America, especially with the muscle that you just said, investing at this intersection of driving more productivity, making sure that we can make a more affordable pound of protein. I think that's just such an interesting thing. So no, thank you so much, Aaron. We call the section winging it, right? So we're basically looking for rapid fire. Some of them are silly, some of them are a little bit more serious. What's your take? Chicken or egg? What came first?
Chicken.
All right. What is something that you and the general public or your colleagues almost always disagree about?
How serious the situation is.
Okay. Who has had the most important influence on you and how you think?
Two people, my father and my wife.
That's wonderful. In the period that you've seen food go all the way from your early days in Eli Lilly all the way through to CEO of BiomEdit, what's the one area where you've seen just significant, dramatic progress?
Yeah, I would just say the advent of drug discovery and design through biotechnology. We're just in an amazing, if you think about it, over the course of my career, we went from the first commercial monoclonal antibody to now, and that was one of all the drugs,
Right.
to now monoclonal antibodies being the dominant drug modality
Right.
in terms of revenue. So just a sea change, right? And a paradigm shift in how things got done. The other is we've moved from random approaches to rational approaches in the process. Everything was screening, trial and error, and now I think we're much, much closer to target equals design equals product.
Super. What is the most frustrating food-related misinformation that you have come across?
That GMOs are by their nature a threat.
Can you double click on that a little bit more, just given the context of the conversation here? I think it's worthwhile maybe taking a minute there.
Yeah, I think we if we think about the first introduction of genetically modified organisms, the scientific community failed in communication, in helping people understand that the science that created the possibility is also sufficient to make sure it contains the threat.
Right.
And the inability to communicate that, I think, resulted in almost a whole generation of people who feared technology advances because of the conclusion that they might draw they could only be bad for us.
No, and I want to stay on this topic because this is one of those areas where the aim of this podcast is to build a bridge, right? It is not intended to be left versus right, industry versus the populace. It's really trying to say, how do we cross that gap? You touched on communication, but what can our listeners do, and what can you and I do about changing that for this next generation?
Yeah, and look, I think we even saw a replay of that in COVID in characterizing the risk and the quality of solutions available for COVID. And so I think we just need to you have to remain a healthy skeptic and practice enlightened self-interest, right? You got to take care of yourself, but you got to get smart in the process, and listen to what people have to say, but don't conclude that you have to follow a trend of a way of thought. And we have resources like we never have had before, right, to make sense of situations. My view is that for whatever reasons, political motives, societal motives, some sort of power play, right, the message gets contorted, distorted, and then people have wrong impressions and make wrong choices or wrong decisions based on that. And that's unfortunate, given that the nature of science is to reveal and to make clear things, not to confound things and cause unrest or concern.
That makes sense. Last question. What is the one thing you can eat for the rest of your life?
Steak.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. How can our listeners find you online?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, our site, obviously our website, BiomEdit.com. I post on LinkedIn, not too frequently, I hope. I'm much less frequent on X or Twitter, but every once in a while I'll put something there that's more personally inspiring than it is, let's say, a company message. I love podcasts. I think yours is a great one, and I've been on a couple of others, and this is an incredible medium for having that next level down of discussion and description of cool topics.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to today's episode. Today's episode was made possible by Ancera, the company that gives poultry companies a bird's eye view into their operations. Find out how Ancera is replacing opinions with objectivity at www.ancera.com.